Welcome to this year's version of the Nobel Prize lectures. As usual, our first speaker is going to be John Reiskind, who really started this course before I joined the curriculum committee some years ago. And John uses this first lecture to sort of tell us about the Nobel Prizes in general, their history a little bit. He doesn't talk about dynamite too much, but which was the source of funding for the Nobel Prizes. But in addition to talking about the prizes in general, he's going to also talk about last year's prize in literature, which was a lady in France. So I might say that John is a retired University of Florida professor of biology. He asked me not to say that his specialty was studying spiders, such as they were. But anyway, despite that, we're delighted that John is going to give us this talk today. So, welcome, John.
Thank you. Hey. So we will now put up, can you hear me? Incidentally, those of you who muted yourselves at home, if you can't hear me, unmute yourself and say louder or just make, some feedback so we know that you're hearing things. So this is, I'm going to be talking today about, in fact, take this here, and we'll be talking about the Nobel Prize in general. I call it a human institution. I think we have to keep that in mind, as you will see.
You want the lights all the way off or no?
It's up to the audience.
Okay.
I wonder if you can dim just the front ones a little bit. I don't want. I want to, this is basically an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about this course itself because this is the 12th year in which we're presenting this. I want to talk about Alfred Nobel, his foundation, and about the prizes in general, and then spend half the lecture on the literature prize this last fall, and the winner, Annie Nobel. So, first of all, this is the 12th year, and this was a fortuitous idea I had. Every fall, the first week of October, day by day, they tell you who won the Nobel Prize in this or that. And I always said, gee, I wonder what the significance of that person's work is for those people. And I was pretty lazy about it. And then I got on the curriculum committee, and all these seminars we give, these courses are 6 weeks long. I said, 6 weeks long and 6 prizes. That's too fortuitous. And so I decided we will get a course on this in which we get an expert on each of these prizes, and I'll be educated. And I have been educated, as it says, to satisfy my curiosity efforts. And we began in the spring of 2012 with the Nobel Prizes of 2011. We've had over 50 experts, including nonagenarian former vice president of the university, dean of the graduate school giving a talk. We've had people like Lauren Groff, novelist in town, the mayor, who is an economist, gave a talk on the appropriate prizes. This term, Ken and I are facilitators. Not only that, but during the pandemic, it was harder to get people to talk, and I discovered the wonders of YouTube and doing some research using the words of the winners themselves. So this is the lineup for this semester. And notice that we have some extraordinary experts speaking, but we also have me speaking 3 times on what I consider the somewhat more subjective Nobel Prizes. And so you're going to see today how it goes with literature, and see how it goes. But in the process, whether I liked it or not, I've become educated on at least 3 of the prizes, and I'm waiting to hear the 3 talks of the ones I haven't. So we're going to start with Alfred Nobel. And because of that thing at the top that has his name, but this is Alfred Nobel. He invented dynamite among 355 patents, a lot of them explosive. And, oh, good, thank you. And as you can see, he was Swedish, and he was born in October, and he died on the 10th of December in 1896. Spoke languages fluently, 5 languages, was a chemist, inventor, entrepreneur, extraordinary person, very wealthy. And in 1888, 8 years before he actually died, his brother died. And a French newspaper mistook the name and gave the headline, Merchant of Death Dies. And he read his own obituary. And this was an embarrassment. And he realized that that's what he was known as. And so he decided to take most of his fortune and put it into something that he felt was more worthwhile. And that's the idea was planted back there. And by the mid-1890s, he had produced a will that contributed most of his funds to a foundation that would give awards for things that made the world better. He left 31 million Swedish krona, today it would be about $183 million, to fund the prizes. So, let's go to the next slide. Maybe I have to.
No, I think when I did that screen thing. Okay. Try now.
Try. There we are. So, in his last will, he specified his fortune to be used in a series of prizes, and this is important, his wording, for those who confer the greatest benefit on mankind in 5 areas: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and finally, peace. All were determined by committees of Swedish institutions except the Peace Prize, which was a committee of the Norwegian Parliament, because Norway was under Sweden at the time. Physics and chemistry by the Swedish Academy of Sciences, they make the decision. Medicine or physiology by the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and literature by the Swedish Academy of Stockholm. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The Peace Prize, as I mentioned, was awarded by a Norwegian legislative committee. Legislation is called the Storting. And this was in his will. Sweden and Norway didn't separate from one another. Norway was kind of a protectorate of Sweden until 1905, and then it became independent. So it's a separate nation since then. The foundation was established in 1900 to invest those funds, and the assets of today is about $450 billion in Swedish krona or whatever. He died on the 10th of December, mentioned already, and that's the date of the awards given each year on the 10th of December. The first prizes were finally awarded in 1901, beginning of the 20th century. Finally, that was 5 prizes that I mentioned. The 6th one in economic sciences was proposed by Reiskind, the Riksbank, which is the Swedish national bank, and it's called, however it's pronounced, a prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. And so that was first given in 1969. And there's a debate whether it's a real Nobel Prize or not, but it's the Swedish Academy of Sciences makes that decision. So I want to talk a little bit about the prizes, but we will be talking about elements of it in my other talks as well. Each prize consists of gold medal, this is one side of it, personal artistic diploma, we'll see some later on in the term, and a cash award worth 10 million Swedish krona, which in today's dollars, I asked Siri and he said it's exactly $1 million. So that's about it right now. Over the years, 615 Nobel Prizes have been awarded to 989 laureates. So you know there that was some of them given to more than one person. And 31 organizations received the Nobel Prize. Those all are in peace, the organizations, and since 1901. And about 6% of the laureates are women. That seems like a low percentage. We'll talk about that as well. Well, here we are. And so they've divided the 20th century in quarters. And the first quarter of the 20th century for women. And I think Marie Curie won twice, so I don't know if you have to go once or twice. And in the second quarter, 8, third quarter, only 3, fourth quarter, 15, and since 2001 through last fall, 31 women. And that's a total of those 61 out of 189. You can ascribe that to systemic sexism or whatever, but there are reasons for that, and we are much more woke now than we were in 1901.
We're making a comeback.
Yeah. Okay. Backwards. Oh no. Yeah. Oh,
Keep going.
okay. Okay. So, yeah. Just for the prize, this is the front of the medal, and that's Alfred Nobel. It's made of 23 karat gold before 1980, and then since then, 18 karat gold plated with 24 karat gold. This is an interesting anecdote. 2 German laureates sent their medals to Copenhagen for safekeeping during World War II. First of all, it was amazing. Hitler prevented some people from even receiving their Nobel Prizes. He did, where they stood on things. But when Germany invaded Denmark, a chemist dissolved them in aquavit, which is tell me what that is, but it's a combination of 2 acids that can actually dissolve gold. And the gold then was recovered from solution, recast to the water. So it has a history. Otherwise, I don't know if anybody has sold their own Nobel Prizes, but who knows. Here is the overall pattern of all the Nobel Prizes. It's a selection process that runs through the whole year leading up to the announcement in October. In fact, it begins a little before the year, and invitations are sent out for nominations to each of these awards. And each award has a different group of people asked to nominate in those specialties, in those areas. The decisions so can nominate, and ultimately have a point here too. Ultimately, it leads to a decision made early in October, and they are announced day by day the first week of October. All decisions cannot be appealed, and names of nominations and who nominated them remain sealed for 50 years. And so we'll get to other situations like that. But and so someone may claim they were nominated, but they don't really know who nominated them. And you're not allowed, at least the literature prize, to nominate yourself. So I thought that was interesting. They've set, or there has been set, and I don't know when in the process, but the maximum of 3 laureates. And a laureate is just the person who receives the award. Maximum of 3 laureates and 2 different works for each Nobel Prize. Though organizations and institutions, as I mentioned before, can be chosen for the Peace Prize, all must be living at the time the award announcement. I think there have been 1 or 2 exceptions, but since then, it's been a tricky thing. In fact, and something I'll mention probably in the last lecture, the Peace Award was given for Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, but he was assassinated for the announcement, so they gave no prize that year, Peace Prize, but
They did have 1 prize
they did.
that was awarded Friday. The recipient had died
Yeah, over the.
that day.
Mhm.
So by the time it was public, he was gone. But for that one, they decided not to.
There have been some exceptions. There was also another Swedish writer that also died earlier, but it's basically the rule, and it's fun. So I'm going to talk about the pageantry, the events, the award ceremonies in future lectures, because I really want to get to today's prize winner. And this prize is the Nobel Prize in Literature, and it was chosen by the Swedish Academy. Now, the Swedish Academy was founded long before the Nobel Prize was proposed. It was founded in 1786, and they have 18 members, and they're elected for life by their peers in a little group there. And this is a meeting in 2016, and what I thought was interesting, they sat around the table. They actually have dinner once a week together. It's very in group, and but I think this woman is the crown princess of Sweden. She looks like the one I've seen in awards. But here is one of their meetings, and the winner is chosen by the Academy. As I said, it was founded by King Gustav III. You all know the royalty of Sweden, and was elected for life. Recently, they've been allowed to resign. In the past, they didn't want to participate, they just didn't come to a meeting, but there is a quorum necessary to choose a Nobel laureate. Elitist, it was contain the best writers and scholars in Sweden, and to guard and nourish the language, putting out an official list of all the recognized words in Swedish. So it's very similar to the French Academy, who still people are so offended by French word the weekend, which gone through. It meets weekly, as I mentioned, at a restaurant in Old Stockholm for a ritual dinner weekly, and also owns real estate, including luxurious apartments in Stockholm and Paris, as investments estimated at $143 million. This will become relevant when I talk about one of the consequences of this group. The 18 members have numerous perks. Place to stay in Paris. And, okay, so back to the selection process, pretty straightforward. Gets nominations. In this case, members of the Academy, members of literature academies, societies, professors of literature and language, former Nobel literature laureates, presidents of writers' organizations are all allowed to nominate candidates. You can't nominate yourself. So these nominations are not from the public in general. You have to be something special. And I've spoken to several people at the University of Florida in other fields that have been asked to nominate in chemistry, strong departments. The deadline for nominations is 1st of February, and then they narrow the field to 20 candidates, and by May to 5 candidates. And then in early October, members of the Academy vote. Candidate who receives more than half of the votes of the 18 is named the Nobel laureate in literature. And then it's about midday or early in the mid-morning in Sweden, they give a phone call. And when you call someone, applies to all the prizes. It's about 3 or 4 in the morning. On the East Coast, about 5, the West Coast, about 2 o'clock in the morning. So there are lots of stories about this phone ringing and people answering it roughly and irritating phone call. So that's very nice. Okay. As I mentioned, his criteria for the prize should have bestowed the greatest benefit on mankind. And writing, the quotes are from his will, in an ideal direction. And this left a lot of room for interpretation. So it's interesting that the criteria has gradually changed to reflect society, at least Swedish society. And in the before World War I, it was conservative idealism, holding church, state, and family sacred. And Rudyard Kipling, one of the youngest winners at the age of 41, was the beneficiaries of those criteria. World War I, Sweden, as until right now, it's been pretty neutral. It's been neutral for a couple of 100 years until the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And now they are joining NATO. They got a green light from Turkey. They haven't. Turkey is blocking them joining. They'd like to join. Finland got the green light. Anyway, the point is that world wars had a real impact on many of the prizes, including as here the literature prize. And so they looked among themselves for the prize winners. And in the 1920s, a kind of a wide-hearted humanity became, and so people like George Bernard Shaw, Thomas Mann, popular writers at the time. By the 30s, they looked for every person, and they picked some popular writers in those days. Pearl Buck, who, in hindsight, didn't really produce a body of work. Instead, I should go step it back here. Literature is awarded for a body of work, not for a single book or a single achievement. At least ideally, that was the criteria. Unlike sciences, where we're talking about specific contributions as well as in the other prizes. So we had Pearl Buck wrote books of China, Sinclair Lewis, Eugene O'Neill, a dramatist. We'll get to that in a minute. By the 1940s, we had these literary pioneers and recognized their names like Hesse and Andre Gide and T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner. And by the 70s and 80s, they realized that they were very Eurocentric, and they started reaching out to unnoticed writers in Europe as well as international. So we have Singer and Samuel Paz, Mexican-American, Toni Morrison, and by the 2000s, beginning of this century, we really go even more, post-colonialism. Paul Boyan from China. he's an interesting one because he worked for the Liberation Army. He had his training and he wrote novels and was paid for by the People's Army. And lately, European English language writers and some of the Western literary traditions. 115 Nobel Prizes have been awarded in literature between 1901 and 2022. 115, but reading my own comments, I've forgotten 119 individuals. So this is an interesting prize. Almost invariably, it's to a single individual, unlike the other prizes. And 102 men and 17 women. Does that add up? Yes, 119. And 11 women since 1990. So making up for lost time. The prize has been shared with two individuals on only 4 occasions. And it wasn't because they jointly wrote the same works, it was that 2 people won. It was not awarded on 7 occasions, and you'll see the coincidence. One was World War I, the other was the Second World War, and I don't know what happened in 1935. The laureates wrote in 25 different languages, of which probably the premier one is at least in Swedish. They have to be able to read it. And I was reminded of the Booker Prize, which is an English prize, writing in English. And as we'll see when we talk about today's, is that they're now giving a Booker Prize in translation. And how important translation is when you have 25 languages. So since the Swedes I've met in travel speak better English than Americans, usually they will either read it Swedish or read it English or some other language they may know, German. So the youngest laureate I mentioned already was Rudyard Kipling, won in 1907, and the oldest laureate to receive the prize was Doris Lessing, who was 88 when she was awarded in 2007. She died at 94. The reason, we'll see some exception, the reason is that we're looking at a body of work. So the idea of writing your first great novel, which is stupendous, is not sufficient. This has not been considered sufficient. So some people have been overlooked because they died young. See that. Okay. So a few years ago, the Nobel Prize Foundation took a poll of which were the most popular literature laureates by how many searched in their website, and came out with 2 Americans and a Chilean as the most popular. And that's understandable. Why? Okay. 2 Nobel laureates, interestingly, in literature, declined the prize. Sartre declined the prize because he never accepted any prizes. So he would at least give him a prize for consistency. And Boris Pasternak initially accepted, and then the Soviet authorities said, no, we can't do that. And so he declined dutifully, but his descendants were able to accept it in his name in 1988 during Glasnost. It's a friendly thing. So there are lots of anecdotes of that sort. A little bit about those who've been overlooked. Some died too soon. Marcel Proust died at 51. Paolo Albino died at 61. And probably would have won, these people generally. Some had fame after their death, which is even more depressing. These artists who sell their works now, I mean, Van Gogh couldn't sell his works, and now they sell for tens of millions of dollars. Poor guy lost there. Others were just passed over, and that's what makes the prize remarkably subjective at times. We'll be talking about other prizes, especially the Peace Prize, and sometimes the Economics Prize, is sending a message. And in literature, it's sending a message as well. So I got a bunch of these from Wikipedia, my favorite. I spend more time on Wikipedia than any other net. So you recognize a lot of people. Mark Twain stands out. Strindberg, Green, Nobel. He studied butterflies. That was his actual training. But anyway, we won't talk about it. It's worth a good read. Okay. And there have been controversies, and I mentioned one earlier. All the Swedes had won. And in the first season of this course, I had Harold Hansen, who's our vice president. He is his specialty was Norwegian poetry. And I asked him to give a talk on the Swedish poet, George Thurlow, and Hansen was in his 90s when he gave this talk here. He had to study for a few weeks and catch up on Swedish poetry, but too many Swedes. And then, as I mentioned, they're sending messages, so they're politically biased and motivated, sometimes left over right. Swedes tend to be really leftist. And Borges was not liberal, but Borges and Neruda was. This recent, did you see that there's recent evidence that he was actually poisoned? He died, it's murdered. Chile. And recently, Peter Handke, an Austrian winner, but a vocal supporter of Serbia during the Yugoslav wars, came under a lot of criticism. The committee came under criticism for choosing him because of his political positions. So you can't escape from politics. And then we have the poet Bob Dylan, who every songwriter is a poet. But he won in 2017. And as I mentioned, Pearl Buck wrote popular books, but in hindsight, looking at her whole works, it didn't quite measure up in some people's views. In 2018, the Nobel Prize was not awarded. Why? Because it was a scandalous affair occurred in the 18. One of the 18 had a husband who leaked the winners' names sometimes, in addition to some sexual misconduct. I don't like to go into the details about it, but he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison in Sweden for rape. They bet each year, at least in France, but maybe everywhere, who's going to win the literature prize. And the evidence that seven times it was leaked by this individual, who was the husband of one of the 18. And so she ultimately withdrew from the 18. It was quite a scandal to the point where no Nobel Prize was given, but the following year they gave Nobel Prizes for the previous 2 years. It's a whole story in itself. There's a wonderful section in Wikipedia called Nobel Prize Controversies, and you can look them up to your heart's desire. Okay, finally, here we have Annie Ernaux. She's the winner of the Nobel Prize. And she was born the same year I was born, so I felt a certain attachment to her. She doesn't speak English and I don't speak French, so It's a limit. This is the wording they have when they announced it: for the courage and clinical acuity with which she uncovers the roots, estrangements, and collective restraints of personal memory. She was the 17th woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I mentioned before, 11 in this century women. And you can count, let's see, and we're in the 23rd year. So you can do that. Okay, so what I want to do today is to I mine certain information from YouTube. And so I wanted to start out with the announcement. The day of the announcement is October 6th, 2022, which was a Thursday. So she was the fourth prize announced. And let's see if this works.
The Swedish Academy in Stockholm has awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Literature to the French author Annie Ernaux. Ernaux is a professor of literature as well as a writer. She was born in 1940 and grew up in Normandy. Her literary work is mostly autobiographical and maintains close links with sociology. The chair, Anders Olsen, explains some of the reasons why the Swedish Academy chose Ernaux for this year's award.
Annie Ernaux was born in 1940 and grew up in the little town of Yvetot in Normandy. Her setting was poor but ambitious, and in her oeuvre she consistently explores the experience of a life marked by great disparities regarding gender, language, and class. Her literary work dealing with her class experience and rural background began early as a memory project with the ambition of widening the boundaries of literature beyond fiction in the narrow sense. In its reconstruction of the past, it leans on Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, but she guides the search in an entirely new direction. Despite her consciously plain literary style, she declares that she is an, quote, ethnologist of herself, end quote, rather than a writer of fiction.
Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by David Levitz from DW Culture. David, tell us a bit more about this year's winner.
Well, Annie Ernaux has said that it's the novelist's job to tell the truth. Certainly that's what she's sought to do across her work, which is all mining of her own autobiography, as we just heard. Some really key points in her career have been her 2008 book, The Years, Les Années, which launched her to international renown. This is the story of a woman. It's told in the third person, but it's very clearly her from the time in France after the Second World War up until the early 2000s, and it shows the shifting of French society through one life. Another book of hers that's gotten a lot of attention is her 2000 novel Happening, about her own abortion that she had at the age of 23 at a time when that was illegal in France and frankly quite dangerous. And the film version of that book won the top honor at the Venice Film Festival last year. She's also written about her relationship with her parents, her own bout with breast cancer, her mother's death, and her affair with a Russian diplomat. So she mines a lot of very personal details that a lot of authors may write about, but not in such a public and personal way. She's also, by the way, the 17th woman to win the prize and the 17th author from France, the country with the most Nobel Prizes in literature thus far.
Okay, so there's always much speculation ahead of time who will get it this time, and there's always you never know whether it's going to be a rather obscure pick or somebody famous. And this year, Salman Rushdie was bandied around, as well as Michel Houellebecq. Right. She is more obscure, is she not?
She's certainly more obscure than those two, although I have to say she's not that obscure. This is the first time in years that we at DW have had pictures of the laureate ready to go. So that hasn't been the case in the last years. We've been caught totally by surprise. She was actually the favorite to win last year, although it seems that she herself didn't expect it. She wasn't by the phone when the Swedish Academy tried to call her this morning. But it seems that she has found out by now that she is this year's laureate. But you're right, it's really unpredictable. And actually, I think that they like to keep it unpredictable. So the word about Rushdie for this year was he survived this knife attack this year. It would have been a very symbolic award for him to get it, a sign of support for freedom of speech. That is true. I personally believe the moment that people start talking that this person's going to get it, you can almost forget it.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. David Levitz, DW Culture.
Okay, we'll get to this in a moment. I was talking to this. First of all, I want to point out that Deutsche Welle, which means German wave, is the news covered by WFT television at 6 o'clock every evening. And I find, if you're interested in what's going on in the world, as opposed to the latest American twist, it's a very straightforward, very clean news broadcast. So I endorse it. It is extraordinary. And so that was on the 6th of October when the Nobel Prize was announced. On the 10th of December, PBS had a little section on it. I think this is interesting too, because as you'll see, finally beat the laureate. So,
on Wednesday in Stockholm, Sweden, French writer. On Wednesday in Stockholm, Sweden, French writer Annie Ernaux delivered her Nobel lecture and spoke of how she hopes that her work, which mixes fiction and memoir, has affected others. Tomorrow, she and this year's other Nobel laureates will formally receive their awards. Jeffrey Brown spoke with her for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
Derrière l'image de la jeune mère lisse.
In a new documentary titled The Super 8 Years, we see a young French woman named Annie Ernaux, a wife and mother, a high school teacher in the early 1970s. What we don't see taking place at this time secretly off camera, the book she's working on, her first. The film, based on home movies and produced many years later by Ernaux and her son, captures the early inner struggles of a woman, as she says, tormented by the need to write of her life, to become what she would later call an ethnologist of myself.
J'espérais vraiment pouvoir transmettre.
I truly hoped to transmit an individual personal experience, but in such a way that it would be received by others. It was really that desire that motivated me to write. To be an ethnologist of myself means to speak from my being, from my experience, but looking at it from a great distance, approaching it from the exterior of myself.
Many books later, Ernaux would win literature's biggest prize.
The Nobel Prize in Literature for 2022 is awarded to the French author Annie Ernaux.
Soon after the announcement, Ernaux, now 82 and living outside Paris, came to New York. We spoke at the office of her longtime U.S. publisher, 7 Stories Press, and I asked about mining the past, in a line that begins The Years, one of her best-known books. All the images, she writes, will disappear.
Alors je pense qu'effectivement, en chacun.
I do think that in each of us, images disappear when we die, and perhaps that's what made me write. To think of this moment when all the images I have seen would disappear, this feeling of the loss of things. But I also think that the true reality of the world is forgetting. We forget a great deal from a collective perspective. For instance, we're always surprised when war arises again, as we're seeing now. So it's more a question of forgetting than of memory. And to write is to fight forgetting.
Et c'est lutter contre l'oubli que d'écrire.
In some 23 volumes, 16 of them translated and published in English, she's written one woman's story, a woman who is both her and not her. She's been described as genre-defying, her books not quite novels, but not traditional memoirs.
Je ne cherche pas à me définir.
I don't try to define myself in terms of genre. For me, the most important thing is to find the form of the writing that fits with what I'm writing. So to me, the right term is writer.
Pour moi, le terme qui convient, c'est écrivaine.
One constant theme, her working-class roots in Normandy, where her parents ran a grocery, far outside France's traditional literary culture. Her move through education and writing into a more intellectual world, and the distance that created from her family and within herself.
D'une certaine manière, je suis toujours entre les deux.
I remain divided between two worlds. Writing is the place where, with the tools I've acquired, I see the world, but always from the world of my youth, which I could never erase, what the writer Albert Camus called the first man. Well, there's a first woman in me, which means that I will always write from that separate place.
Depuis ce lieu séparé.
Has it been important to you as a woman to tell stories that perhaps are less told?
Il est évident que
It's obvious that these stories haven't been told, especially because they haven't been told in the way I wanted them to be told.
pas raconté comme je le voulais.
Without sentimentality, but with finely crafted language and probing honesty, always working from memory, she's written of deeply personal and traumatic experiences. In Happening, first published in 2000, and recently turned into a feature film.
Ça fait mal? Oui. Tout le temps que ça dure.
She looks back to a 1963 pregnancy and abortion, an almost barbaric procedure that nearly killed her, at a time when abortion was still illegal in France. The story, she knows, has a new relevance.
C'est un problème qui, au fond, peut-être.
It's a problem that wasn't ultimately resolved. I think my book Happening reveals the savagery of abortion for women when it is banned, but those things are forgotten.
Il y a eu l'oubli de ces choses-là.
Are you surprised that what you experienced so long ago and then wrote about could perhaps be with us again?
Je suis surtout horrifiée.
Above all, I'm horrified and outraged that this could happen again. At the same time, I think that there is something about the power of women to bring children into the world that men wanted to appropriate and once again want to appropriate.
Veulent à nouveau s'approprier.
Sometimes in the books, you seem to be trying to understand what you're writing. At the end of A Woman's Story, you write, "This isn't a biography, neither is it a novel, maybe a cross between literature, sociology, and history."
Les phrases que vous citez dans Une femme, le livre sur ma mère,
the sentences that you quoted from A Woman's Story, the book about my mother, were indeed about trying to situate myself in relationship to what I'd just written. It's work to write, and I want the reader to understand that I'm asking myself questions. For me, to write is to go looking for what I don't even know myself before I write it.
Avant de l'écrire.
In her Nobel lecture, Annie Ernaux spoke of her hope that her work can, quote, shatter the loneliness of experiences endured and repressed and enable beings to reimagine themselves. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in New York.
So it's really quite fascinating to listen to the author herself. I'm going to end up with an interview that was made 5 years ago, 4 years almost to the day that she had received the Nobel Prize in New York. And wanted to just point out something I meant to point out, and that is the majority of Nobel laureates have written bodies of work that have been novels for the most part. But there have been playwrights as well as poets. And a few years ago, Lauren Groff spoke about Alice Munro, the Canadian short story writer. So it's been a diverse thing, and of course Bob Dylan. So that's good. So I'm going to play a little part of this. I might control where we are in this computer, and then I'll read a little bit. If you don't mind. Let's play this. This was in New York.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. I just checked before we kick off. I can see the crowd stretching off to the horizon there. Just give me a little wave if you can hear me. Okay. And I think I have people upstairs as well. Can you hear me upstairs? Okay, we'll take that one on trust. We're honoured to welcome Annie Ernaux to Shakespeare and Company tonight to celebrate the English publication of The Years. Spanning 1941 to 2006, The Years is a biography of both a woman and a nation during an era of unprecedented social flux. It's a meditation on the nature of passing time, on memories, as well as the tools and media that shape them. Reflecting on the shifting aspirations of the post-war generation, the rights of women, social class, the impact of May '68, the rise of consumerism, and how such events do, or sometimes do not, impact upon the life of an individual, The Years has been called a remembrance of things past for our age. Crisply, elegantly, and faithfully translated by Alison L. Strayer for Anglophone readers keen to understand contemporary France, I can't think of a better, more compelling read than The Years. Born in 1940, Annie Ernaux grew up in Normandy, studied at Rouen University, and later taught at a secondary school. From 1977 to 2000, she was a professor at the Centre National d'Enseignement par Correspondance. Her books, in particular A Man's Place and A Woman's Story, have become contemporary classics. The Years won the Prix Renaudot in France in 2008 and the Premio Strega in Italy in 2016. In 2017, Annie Ernaux was awarded the Marguerite Yourcenar Prize for her life's work. We're also delighted to be joined for this celebration by several of the key protagonists in bringing Annie Ernaux to readers of English. The translator of The Years, Alison L. Strayer, Annie Ernaux's American publisher for around 3 decades, Dan Simon of Seven Stories Press, and Jacques Testa of Fitzcarraldo Editions, the UK.
About 8:45 or so.
The story of origins. Men and women began to appear.
Dans la table sans fin des jours de fête, au milieu des rires et des exclamations, on prendra bien le temps de mourir, allez, la mémoire des autres nous plaçait dans le monde.
And now in English, we're reading her own translation, Alison L. Strayer.
From the polyphonic clangor of holiday meals, before the quarrels began with eternal enmities sworn, another great story emerged in fragments, intertwined with the one about war, the story of origins. Men and women began to appear, some nameless except for a kinship title, father, grandfather, great-grandmother, reduced to a character trait, a funny or tragic anecdote, the Spanish flu, the embolism, or kick from a horse that carried them off, and children who hadn't lived to be our age, a multitude of characters we'd never know. Over years, and with no small effort, the tangled threads of family were unraveled, until at last the two sides could be clearly distinguished, the people who were something to us by blood, from those who were nothing. Family narrative and social narrative are one and the same. The voices around the table mapped out the territories of youth, countrysides and farms where for time immemorial men had been hired hands and girls housemaids. The factory where they had all met, stepped out together and married. The small businesses to which the most ambitious had risen. They told stories that contained no personal detail except for births, weddings, and funerals, no travel except to regiments in distant garrison towns, existences entirely filled by work, its harsh conditions, the perils of drink. School was a mythical backdrop, a brief golden age with the schoolmaster as its rough god, equipped with an iron ruler for the rapping of knuckles. The people who were something
Tout son corps et qui faisait monter des larmes, recensait en dehors des enfants qui n'avaient pas atteint notre âge.
I thought it would just give you, I think it's important that this is the actual translator of her novel, that she is reading this. And the importance of translation is getting much more credit, as I mentioned, in the Booker Prize. So now, please go on to the next slide if there is one. maybe it doesn't prevent me. Okay, so now I'd like to read a little to you for a moment so we can turn the lights on. I wanted to mention that the library, our public library, didn't have many books of hers when the award was announced. I think there were two, and I read one of them that I could get a hold of. Now it has a whole array of, they're not novels, they're memoirs, they're books of hers. And it's a very tricky thing. And I'm reminded of a Nobel Prize winner about 5 years ago by the name of Svetlana Alexievich. And she wrote about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan by interviewing veterans and writing up the interviews. And so we're dealing now with nonfiction. I didn't mention that as a list of reasons to give the Nobel Prize, but the nonfiction is, I guess everything is fiction in an odd sort of way, because the writer then takes reality and writes about it. And this is very true of Annie Ernaux, as well as Svetlana Alexievich. So I wanted to just read one or two little portions of her works. Won't take a minute. This one is called Things Seen. Basically, it's basically a kind of a notebook of the years 1993 through about 2001, and you read it and they're dated, but they're not continuous. There's a month between entries. So I like this one. This was 1997, August 1st. The 122-year-old woman, humanity's most senior citizen, Jean Calment, has died. Almost national mourning. Of her life, she leaves no testimony likely to be universally conveyed, not even a diary. Her only achievement was living a life that continued beyond all expectations. Jean Calment was just time, the very incarnation of time, time that we did not experience. Her existence went back to where neither our memory nor that of our parents or even our grandparents could go. Her eyes saw a world now unimaginable to us. She was 10 years old at the time of Victor Hugo's funeral, 20 at the time of the Dreyfus affair. She was a middle-aged woman when the soldiers of 1914 enthusiastically went off to battle. She could have known, as they say, Maupassant, Verlaine, Zola, Proust, Colette, Ravel, Modigliani, younger than her, long dead. You could use the outline of this small woman without history all the more easily as she had no history, to mark all the pages of the century that she experienced, unscathed, almost without memories. For the person people tended to credit with the century's collective memory could only remember the assassination of the Tsar's family in 1917. She was pure, biological time, freed of horror and upheaval. So it sounds like just a report. And she goes about on her going to work and commenting on things she sees, and yet they have a kind of a resonance. The book that they mentioned a great deal, and is probably her singular greatest venture, was The Years. And these are years from 1940, see where I was born, to around 2005, I think. And it starts, I'll just read you a little bit, which I like. Just the first paragraph. the book. It is a sepia photo, oval-shaped, glued inside a little cardboard folder with a gold border and protected by a sheet of embossed semi-transparent paper. Below are the words "Photo moderne, Dell Lilbo Telephone 80." A fat baby with a full, pouty lower lip, brown hair pulled up into a big curl, sits half naked on a cushion in the middle of a carved table. The misty background, the sculpted garland of the table, the embroidered chemise that rides up over the belly. The baby's hands hides its sex. The strap slipping from the shoulder onto the chubby arm suggests a cupid or a cherub from a painting. All the relatives must have received the print and immediately tried to discern whose side the child took after. In this piece of family archives, which must date from 1941, it's impossible not to be a ritual petite bourgeois staging for the entrance into the world. Of course, that's a picture of her as a newborn. And she never uses I, and it's third person, and it's just good reading. It's interesting reading. So I recommend it. Library has a bunch of copies now, so just go in and reserve it, and they'll text you when it's available, which is in a day or two. And I recommend this author. It's been a pleasure to read. And I've read many of the, as they win them, I read their books, and some just make no sense with it. And while I had the job of critiquing things, I went to the movies last Friday night and saw Everything Everywhere All at Once. Makes no sense to me. It had some nice visuals, but I thought it was ridiculous. Won the Nobel Prize for Best Picture. That has nothing to do with this topic at all, and I'm looking forward to the next 5 lectures, the last 2 of which I'm going to give in a similar fashion, pulling the words of the winners to illustrate the significance of this as they see it, or as commentators see it. Here I am. In regard to the Nobel Prizes in 2022. Thank you for coming. Oh yeah, questions. Any questions? Not that I know her personally, but I do overlap the same years. And I'm tempted to start writing myself. It's just observations, but she really has a you could one other for 50 years. Yeah.
Shakespeare
That's in the, I assumed it was in New York, but I'm not sure about that. There is a Shakespeare company in Paris, isn't there?
But I think it said New York.
This was in New York.
The interviews, she was being talked to in English and responding in French.
Right.
Does she understand English and doesn't want to speak it? Or?
I suspect she understands English. Almost all Europeans understand if they're not in the Iron Curtain. It's Russian. And when I was visiting the Czech Republic a few years ago, you go out of Prague and nobody speaks English. At least not many people do. But of course in Scandinavia and French don't like to speak anything but French. I've been to meetings, spider meetings, and technological congresses, and for a while, French who got funding from the French institutions were required to give their talks in French. They were not allowed to give them in other languages. That was in the 60s and 70s. By the 80s and 90s, they got out of that restriction. And did have French college. It's never really good student French. I like to listen to. It's such a beautiful language to listen to.
Anne Marie, go ahead. You have a question on Zoom?
Good. Hi.
Oh, no, I didn't. I was applauding. That was my little applause sign. But I just did want to say there are 3 Shakespeare's and Company in New York. One's on Broadway, one's on Lexington. I don't know where the third one is, but she was there. That was, I've seen that clip before, so she was definitely in New York.
Good. Great. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
A number of PBS NewsHour programs where the interviewer is, of course, speaking in English. There seems to be an intermediary translation there that we don't see on the screen, but that I've seen that often.
Yeah, and in this case, there was a woman making notes of what she said. Being a translator of literature, let alone live translation, has always amazed me. So,
But if you participate in a session where there's instantaneous translation,
yeah,
it's impressive. I mean, it really works.
it is. I mean, how they can listen to one ear with another language at the same time. And I am really impressed nowadays with the translation tools that we have, the apps we have. They really come out, and probably due to AI as well. They come up with translations that are not they're not and they're smooth translations. Still thank you. Okay, well, we'll be all here next week, and we'll hear from our Ken Burns, who will be talking about the theology prize. Oh yeah, about ancient DNA. Yeah, Neanderthal, which I have.
In your relationship.
I have 2.8% Neanderthal. That's 23andMe will tell you what proportion you are Neanderthal. It explains a great deal.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.